So this is Mark Patterson. I'm going to call the New York State Cemetery Board meeting, September board meeting to order. I see we have all of our members are present. As I have in previous meetings in the new era, I just do a little bit more rehearsal up front just to see if it can help the meeting go smoother. Just general protocols. I think we've heard some people discussing this meeting's recorded. We do ask everyone to identify themselves when they're speaking each time. It's hard to remember to do it, but it'd be great if you can. This is a public meeting. You can identify yourself in WebEx and let us know if you'd like to speak using the chat function, or I'll try to just go around and ask people to speak later on. And there will be an opportunity for the public to speak. When we get to that point, I'll ask for the people to go into that opportunity. We may go to executive session. I think today we will. If we do, we'll take a vote and we'll reconvene to come back out of the meeting and adjourn the meeting. So that's you'll need to hang around or let us know, and we'll try to text you when we're coming back out. Today's agenda, again, I've added a process where we explain the new rules for allowing for remote meetings and our public notice. Get that from Tony. Then we'll move to a regular agenda, approve the minutes. We'll have the legislation, rules and regulations report, the division report, the vandalism report, and then we'll have presentations of the applications. Those applications will be presented separately and discussion by members and a vote. We will vote to go into executive session, and we will come back out of executive session into public session before we adjourn the meeting. So that's sort of the run of show in the pandemic era. Glad you're all here, and let me just start out by asking all of the members of the Cemetery Board to identify themselves. I am Mark Patterson. I'm the chair representing Secretary of State Rosanna Rosado.
Hi, I'm Jill Faber, representing Attorney General Letitia James.
Thank you. Tom?
Good morning. This is Thomas Fuller, representing Dr. Howard Zucker for the Department of Health.
Great. Thank you both for being here. Hope everybody had a great Labor Day holiday. Let's go to the review and approval of the minutes. Tony, can you talk to us about the new rules for remote meetings and our public notice and why we're on solid ground?
Sure. Thank you, Mark. So as in the past few months, we are acting under Governor's Executive Order 202.1, which this portion of the open meetings law portion of it has been extended just this past Friday, I believe. The section relevant to us is suspension of law allowing the attendance of meetings telephonically or other similar service. Article 7 of the Public Offices Law is modified to permit any, hearing some background noise.
Please mute your phones if you're not speaking.
Permit any public body to meet and take such actions authorized by the law without permitting in public, in-person access to meetings, and authorizing such meetings to be held remotely by conference call or similar service, provided that the public has the ability to view or listen to such proceeding, and that such meetings are recorded and later transcribed, and this meeting is being recorded. This executive order has been interpreted to suspend the requirement that board members be physically convened or convened by video conferencing, to suspend the requirement that notice of the meeting include the physical location of each board member who is participating by telephone or similar means. We've given the public notice of the meeting and how to attend by video conference or by telephone conference. In fact, logged on through the public notice, so the link works. And the board agenda and board material has been placed on the Cemetery's website. As Mark said, we do take attendance. If you're a lobbyist, you must identify yourself. If you are representing a cemetery, you should also identify yourself. And of course, if you're going to speak for the purposes of the record, you should identify yourself when you speak. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. I appreciate that. Are there any questions from board members about our status here? No? If we
None
can
here.
move on. Yeah. You good? We'll move on to the minutes, review of the minutes. Do I have any concerns or corrections to the minutes as distributed?
No concerns.
No, I have none.
Only note, I did not have an opportunity to review the minutes. I would ask that the board go ahead and approve them. If I see anything that needs to change, we could always modify that next month.
Okay. So I'll make a motion to approve the minutes as distributed. Do I have a second?
I'll second that.
Thank you, Tom. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Thank you.
Aye.
Minutes are approved. Next on our agenda is a report from our counsel, Tony Melillo, on legislation and rules and regulations. He may kick that to Lewis, but Tony, do you have any update for us?
Well, I didn't provide the board with a written update on legislation. To my knowledge, there hasn't been any movement since the last monthly report. The bills that were signed are still pending action or inaction by the governor. I don't believe any other bill saw action. So there was no written report. And on regulation, we did meet with representative of NYSAC on the portion that has been drafted of proposed regulation for abandonments, and I'm sure Lewis is going to talk about that in more detail.
Thank you, Tony. Any questions of Tony from members of the board?
No, thank you.
No, none here. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Can we move to the division report? Or maybe it's next to the vandalism report. Is Lewis or Alicia?
Division report first, generally.
Division report, go for it.
Yeah. So I have two unrelated things. Thing number one is sort of an observation. As you guys all know, we've been collecting burial data from selected downstate cemeteries and cremation data from crematory statewide since April. And we've noticed that for the last 9 weeks, including the week, not last week, but the week before, we don't have last week's data yet. So during that period, burials at the cemeteries we've been surveying were noticeably below the average number for 2019. Now, we're not public health experts or epidemiologists, so I'm not going to speculate as to what to make of that, but I did find that to be a very interesting trend. And not being a statistician, I'm guessing it's a trend, but we've shared that information with the Mortuary Affairs Task Force and the Department of Health to see if they have any comment on that. But again, I thought it was an interesting piece of data that was worth sharing. It's obviously very good news in general, regardless of the reason for it. Totally separate and apart from that, I guess mostly separate and apart from that, we've been tracking, we've tried to get in touch with a selection of cemeteries that never experienced significant delays in burials during the downstate cemeteries that never experienced significant delays in burials during the pandemic, to try to learn what they did to stay ahead. I've got a draft memo. It's still internal, but I can share with you. We spoke to representatives of 6 cemeteries. These are not necessarily the only ones that did not fall behind. They're just the ones that we selected. We tried to choose a cross section of them. Those cemeteries were Kensico Cemetery, Montefiore, New Montefiore Cemetery, Kensico Cemetery in Westchester, New Montefiore Cemetery in Suffolk, Oak Hill Cemetery in Rockland, Pine Lawn Memorial Park in Suffolk, Old Montefiore Cemetery in Queens, and United Hebrew Cemetery in Staten Island. So broadly speaking, what we found is that these cemeteries experienced had burials of between twice and 6 times the normal, their average number of burials during the height of the pandemic. So we wanted to find out from them, what do they do to keep up? We basically asked them the question of what worked. We got responses along the lines of the following. They reassigned office staff to handle to focus on interment orders. They deferred non-essential paperwork, and I'll add other non-essential tasks. We'll get to that. Allocated designated specialized staff to handle things to the people who could work fastest on things, worked on them. Set up a dry erase board where everyone could see the workflow. Extending hours. One actually reduced hours instead to focus on key tasks and maximize social distancing. Barring entry to the office, handling interment paperwork out on a table outside the office, holding daily meetings on workflow, and contactless grave sales via both emailable forms and something as simple as putting a traffic cone at the grave so people could come and see it without having to meet with anyone. On the grounds work, the things they did included making pods of crews to minimize risk minimize the risk that an infection would shut down operations, running multiple shifts at extended hours, and deferring things like grounds maintenance, monument setting, etc., that did not have to happen. In terms of burials, some imposed restrictions stricter than the 10-person restriction that was no more than 10 people restriction that was in effect at the height of the pandemic, reducing it to even fewer people. Interestingly, none of the cemeteries we surveyed barred attendees, family members altogether, and we do know that 1 or 2 cemeteries in the state did do that, but none of these ones did. One thing they did across the board was set up very tight time slots for burial, multiple time slots, and schedule those out without any flexibility as to when you could come. In other words, you come at 10, you come at 10:30, you come at 11, you come at 11:30, very tightly scheduled. Some extended their burial hours. Some they did, another thing they did was do away with chairs and canopies. And another thing they did, which both helped them keep up and protected safety, is allowing the family to approach only when crews finished lowering. We got very few responses on what we would do differently. We asked the question of what they would do differently. Mostly it was implement the pandemic response sooner, improve and streamline communications with families, and to the extent they were limiting visitors, limiting attendees at burials, imposed that limit at the point of entry to the cemetery, rather than letting more people into the cemetery, but trying to control who got out of their cars. We then asked, what would they want from us? What do they want us to know? And they said, or what would they want us to know beyond our questions? They said essentially, they wanted clearer and faster communication as to new state directives, whether those are Department of Health or executive orders. They would like funeral directors to let families know of COVID restrictions in advance. And they had trouble at the beginning, both getting PPE and figuring out what PPE they needed in the first place. There's a lot more specifics that we got from them. I'm not going to go into more of those specifics. I think we'll ultimately turn this into a document that can be shared publicly. And, we're considering our next steps on this. We're also going to be sharing this, hopefully, once it's been reviewed here with the Mortuary Affairs Task Force and hopefully stakeholders. Again, I just wanted to give people a flavor of this. Now, I want to say one important thing, which is the fact that we sort of singled out these cemeteries as ones that kept up does not mean that they were the only ones downstate who kept up. It also does not mean that the cemetery that we necessarily find any fault with the cemeteries that fell behind. I think one thing we're going to have to try to do is actually schedule similar conversations with the cemeteries that did fall behind to try to see why that happened, if we can figure out why that happened. But nobody is suggesting nobody from the division is suggesting that anyone from any of our out of the regulated cemeteries. I think I just talked myself into a corner there. It's our view that all the regulated, to the extent we know, the regulated cemeteries all did their best to keep up and all made best efforts, et cetera. And some fell behind, others didn't. The goal of this is not to penalize anyone or to necessarily say, hey, you're better than such and such, but to figure out, is there something we can learn from this that will be helpful for everyone else to learn, either in case of a second wave or in case of any other mass fatality incident. So that's more or less what I've got. I'll also note that continuing education, Tom's bailiwick, continuing education for funeral directors is resuming, and division staff, myself included, are going to be presenting virtually to various sessions on this. We're mindful of both the need to maximize social distancing where possible, but also to be mindful of the state's travel budget. And where we can do things virtually, we are obviously going to be doing that. And that's all I had on the division report. I know it was pretty lengthy. I'll be happy, if anyone wants, I'm happy to share those points with the board separately, and hopefully we can get something out to the public at some point.
Thank you, Lewis. Anything else on regulations or whatever that we're working on?
No, we got good comments from they were all really kind of small picture comments, but necessary tightening of our language and honing of it from NYSAC. We're going to be considering that at the everyone but council level, and then sharing our consolidated response with council to do a little legal fine tuning. The next step, of course, is drafting what happens. So what council's drafted so far is what regulations are we going to have in place to try to prevent abandonment and have a process of prevention of abandonment. The next piece is, if that can't happen, how are we going to, what are the mechanics of abandonment going to look like? As we all saw from Cicero, that's something that I think we ought to say some more about in a formal way. But that's all I've got.
Okay. Anybody, board members, have questions of Lewis's report?
No questions.
Lewis.
Thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Tom?
Lewis, I was curious if you heard from any of the larger upstate cities about any capacity issues during the peak of the pandemic, especially Buffalo, Rochester, Syracuse.
We haven't surveyed them quite unscientifically. We're unaware of any cemetery outside of the downstate, outside of the New York City metropolitan area burials falling behind. It's our understanding that I know that what's it called in particular, Forest Lawn did implement some fairly extensive changes to keep up with burials, but I don't believe, we haven't been surveying them, but I don't believe they had anything like the increase in numbers that occurred downstate. And I don't think they ever fell behind in any meaningful way.
All right, thank you.
The issues that we saw outside of New York City were people trying to bring larger groups than either the law permitted or the law might have permitted those larger groups, but the cemetery was being even stricter than the law. That was the main thing we saw outside the downstate region. Now, upstate crematories are a different matter. The crematories in Binghamton, in Albany, and the entire Hudson Valley all saw additional volume. Brookside up in Watertown all saw additional volume, and actually many of the crematories up the I-87 corridor did experience significant delays in cremation during the pandemic. That is not something we saw outside, and every single downstate cemetery had every single downstate crematory had significant delays during the pandemic. So that was definitely more of an issue. We do have something that we're working on to try to study why that was and what one could do about that, but that's really fairly initial stage, and we're going to need some help from some people in your shop on that, which I've reached out to through the Mortuary Affairs Task Force.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Being no other questions for Louis, then can Louis, you or Alicia, give us the vandalism report, and we'll look at those applications.
Alicia, can you do the honors?
Yep. So we've collected $452,697 in vandalism fees for the calendar year so far. Assessment collections were $259,956. Fiscal year collections, vandalism $68,365, assessment $43,124. There really hasn't been any additional payments made on applications since the last board meeting. $27,715.92 has been paid on the $294,122.98 worth of applications that have been approved so far this fiscal year. We have 2 applications before the board this month, totaling $49,045.65. We've collected 1,248 annual reports so far, of which 376 were filed online, which represents about 30% of all reports filed.
Thank you, Alicia. Are there any questions for Alicia on the vandalism report? Okay, thank you. So we have 2 applications for the vandalism fund. The first is Hope Cemetery in Steuben County for $22,650.87. Is there any description of that you're providing, Louis or staff?
Mike, are you on?
I am. This is Mike Seelman from Division of Cemeteries. It's a very straightforward hazardous monument application for 21 monuments. The investigator was out and determined that the monuments were indeed hazardous and reviewed the estimates to make the repairs and felt that they appeared adequate and recommends approval in the amount of $22,650.87.
Thank you, Mike. Tony, do you have any comments on the vandalism application for Hope Cemetery?
Just one, I'll note that division acknowledges in report that the public notice that the cemetery only gave the names of the lot owners, didn't give the lot numbers. We've tried to encourage and make sure that the cemeteries put both in the legal notice, because the intent is to get notice out to the lot owners and get them to put up funds when they can, especially if there's insurance. But what used to occur was the notice used to just have lot numbers and not names, and I've always felt that that was insufficient to give notice. In this case, they had the names and not the numbers. And the names is the more important. They should always have both, but and I'm told by division that the cemetery has been apprised of their mistake in that going forward. They know to have both. The point is, I don't think that should stop the board from approving the application. And I see no other issues with this application.
Thank you, Tony. Okay, so I'll put it on the table for discussion and approval. I'll make a motion to approve the application of Hope Cemetery for vandalism funds in the amount of $22,650 and 87 cents, subject to fund availability, budget crisis aside. Do I have a second?
Second.
Thank you, Jill. Any discussion? Any other discussion? All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Application is approved. Second application is Baptist Rural Cemetery in the amount of $26,394.78 in Wayne County. And Mike or whoever, do you want to give us any description of this application?
Yes, this is Mike again. This was actually in my region, so I did the original report, and I went out and I looked, and I noted that the 15 monuments that they had requested as hazardous were indeed hazardous. They're going to use this is actually a follow-up application. They had I think they had 2 previous applications, and at this point, there are no monuments that we have discovered that appear to be hazardous at that cemetery other than these. They used the previous allocation properly and had the repairs done. We inspected that and they paid the contractor. And I determined that these 15 monuments appear hazardous and recommended approval in the amount of $26,394.78.
Thank you, Mike. I'll put this on the table, make a motion to approve the application of Baptist Rural Cemetery for the amount of $26,394.78 from our vandalism fund, subject to fund availability. Do I have a second?
Second?
Thank you, Jill. All in favor? Aye.
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 Motion carries. Thank you very much. That completes the applications for vandalism fund. We have several applications, other applications. I think the first is Woodlawn Cemetery for a mausoleum. Lewis or staff?
That was me. So I'll address it. So Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx is very low on grave space, on burial space, and has primarily shifted primarily to selling mausoleum space in the last few years. They are looking to build a smallish mausoleum project in it's in an older section of the cemetery. There's a road that they closed on notice to the lot owners and us several years ago that they don't really need to access those graves. They're going to be building these more or less prefabricated structures that are just going to be outdoor crypts. I believe the term is a garden mausoleum, but they're not really buildings. They're more like a larger version of a prefab columbarium. There's going to be some landscaping associated with it, and we think that the project is going to be quite successful for them. They posted the required signs, a copy of that's in the application. I saw the signs myself when I went to the cemetery. They've received no adverse comments, and they are. And we are recommending that the project be approved.
Tony, I know the holiday and a bunch of other stuff going on, but did you get a chance to review this application for the mausoleum?
Yes, I did, Mark. So I'm going to start a little backwards. I usually start with concerns about, the cemetery itself. I'm going to start with the transaction first. Louis, I noticed in the application that the cemetery seeks to sell space before they've even completed construction.
Correct.
Sell space during construction. And
Correct.
Even though our accountant reports that the entire funds are coming from general funds, those sales are going to.
No, they're not.
They're
going to hold the money in trust.
Okay. So it will, I think the cemetery representative may have misspoke then. But can you elucidate that issue? And then I'll get into the questions about
They are in fact going to sell pre-construction. They are going to keep the money in trust until the spaces are available. The money to build the units and is going to all come from general fund.
The reason I raise it, I know we've had trouble in the past where space was pre-sold. Does division have any concerns about that? Probably your experience with other issues?
First of all, they're going to trust the money. Second of all, the biggest issues we've had where space was pre-sold were where cemeteries went ahead and built stuff without our approval. this is seeking our approval. So if we approve, I'm obviously much less concerned about that. And third of all, frankly, Woodlawn's good for it, even if they weren't trusting the money, which they are.
So getting to the questions I have about the cemetery, I noticed in its financial information that officer salary has grown significantly in only 3 years, from 535,000 total officer salary to 862,000. That's a 61% jump in only 3 years. This is really more a question for Jill, since this is the kind of thing I would assume Office of Attorney General might focus on if one of their charities, something like that, in one of the charities, does that raise any concerns or issues? Or for either division or Attorney General?
I mean, it certainly in a vacuum, it does. That does seem significant in the context of, that short period of time. And, if brought to our attention, depending on the context, the Attorney General's office and its, regulatory function with regard to not-for-profit corporations might do an analysis to see if it was consistent with the not-for-profit's obligations. In this case, again, because it's not clear that there's a particular context either coming from the organization or folks outside the organization bringing it to our attention. I don't see this as something that would need to be addressed sort of sua sponte, if you will, unless you feel, or other board members feel, that there is some connection to that increase or concern about that increase with the transaction that we're asked to approve. Is there? Do you have a concern as it relates to the transaction?
Well, no, I don't. I just wanted to flag it, see what division had to say about it, see what your office had to, what you had to say.
Yeah, no, I would, if division has any additional context, changing roles, changing, scope of responsibilities that they know might have, contributed to that increase. I think that would be something that would be important to note.
Louis, do you have anything on that?
No, not really. We have not had the opportunity to raise it with the cemetery.
Just two other issues or questions, really. They mentioned that they've identified approximately 20 acres of undeveloped land for future development. Your report indicates that they're pretty much sold out. Is this land that they're thinking of acquiring? I just wanted some clarification there.
Answer is I'll defer to the cemetery as to what precisely they're talking about. I think it's unused land within the cemetery. Mitch, are you on the phone, or Dave?
This is Dave Fleming. This is Dave Fleming representing Woodlawn. I would just to follow up with Mr. Malillo's previous comment. I think if you look at salaries overall for the cemeteries on the end of on page 137 of the application, it shows an increase of $200,000 over a 4-year period. And that's overall through the cemetery. As far as the lands remaining to be developed, the cemetery has undergone a significant review and starting to plan for reclamation of similar projects like the one before the board today. There is not wholesale large sections that are undeveloped. It's about reclaiming areas that could be used like roadways for this type of development.
There's absolutely no contiguous land they could acquire. I'm not sure there's any non-contiguous land they could acquire for that matter.
20 acres of undeveloped land. It kind of stood out in the application. All right. The only other question I had, the financial statement of the cemetery, there's this note. This is in page 110 of the packet. It's entitled Interfund Borrowings. By action of the New York State Cemetery Board, Supreme Court, Albany, New York, the cemetery has agreed to repay outstanding borrowings from the principal fund and surplus fund. Payment is being made in quarterly installments of $50,000 until December 31, 2021, $100,000 thereafter, with an interest rate of 3.19%. Any idea? It says the balance of the interfund liability at December 31, 2019 was $4,952,860. Louis, do you have any information about what that is, where that came from?
Around that's so we sued, well, the AG sued the cemetery back in the late 90s. I've spoken to them about it. They characterize it, which I think is accurate. I haven't had a chance to actually, between the time I got this comment and now, there was no way I could physically go to the office, and that's the only way I could review the papers. But the recollection was that my recollection, which is consistent with what the cemeteries told me, is that they had used PC principal and PM principal for maintenance. The way the cemetery characterized it is they essentially adopted a total return approach to their funds, which of course is not something our statute permits. They argued till they were blue in the face that it was permissible. They lost. And they've been repaying that ever since. Again, this is previous management. This is like 2 managements ago. It wasn't even the people previous to Mitch. It was the people before them. And the litigation was settled with the AG, and this is the repayment. And as far as I know, they're current on their repayments.
Any idea when repayment would be complete, and why not accelerate? They certainly have the funds to accelerate.
I don't, off the top of my head, know when the last payment's due. I vaguely remember it being a 30-year agreement, but I could be. I'll be candid. I could be totally wrong about that. Which would have it done around 2030, if that's right. Mitch, I don't know if you know any more precisely about what the.
As the accounting note states, the court's order and schedule is being followed. I don't know the exact end date, but the cemetery obviously takes a bigger view of what their assets are and how they allocate them throughout the year based on liabilities. So right now they're sticking to the schedule as outlined by the court.
I mean, the only other wrinkle here is, I mean, so long as they I mean, obviously you can invest in different things in the, you invest differently when the money is unrestricted than when it's restricted. I don't know how much that's a factor really.
Those are all the questions I have, Mark.
Thank you, Tony. Okay, any other questions by members of the board?
I have none.
There being none, I'll make a motion to approve the application from Woodlawn Cemetery for a mausoleum. Let me just pick up well, I don't have the number right in front of me, but we'll approve the application for their application. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Okay. Motion's all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Motion carries. Application is approved. The second application is from Old Montgomery Cemetery, major renovation new section. Can staff present the application?
Carrie, are you on? Do you want to do this or do you want me to do this?
It doesn't matter. I can do it.
All right, so go ahead.
Old Montefiore, which is in southeastern Queens, is a cemetery that has a parcel of land, about 2 acres, across the Springfield Boulevard from the cemetery itself, and they wish to develop that for future grave space. The cemetery feels that they can recoup their original output in about 5 years, and they will have a significant financial gain if they develop this section, which they've owned for a very long time. and they have had this on the back burner for a long time, waiting to develop it, and they feel that now is a good time to do so, because they do have gray space left, but they don't have a lot of areas where anybody can buy a family lot. And by developing this section, it would afford space for family plots to be bought, and they feel that this will sell quickly and is financially a good idea for the cemetery to develop it now. They're seeking board approval for that application.
And it's in the amount of what?
I am looking at my report.
1.5 million.
Thank you.
Thanks. Sorry, I can't get to the page on time. Yes, 1.5, and they expect returns of almost $30 million after allocation of $7,740,000 to the permanent maintenance fund.
Okay. Tony, did you have any questions or comments?
So good news. Well, this application raises the question that the land that they're developing is across the street from their main cemetery. And with our revised interpretation, we now know that our revised understanding of cemetery law, we now know that a cemetery has to be one continuous tract of land. The question has been posed to me before, well, if it's across the street, is that still one continuous tract of land? I've expressed the hopeful opinion that a court would view it that way. I now have found authority for that position. It's in Line Cemetery Association, 93 Appellate Division 19, 1904 decision, which is a notable decision for other reasons. Cemeteries, the Court of Appeals had ruled cemeteries can't exercise condemnation eminent domain because they were operated for private benefit, not public. The law was radically altered in response to that, and this case said that with those changes, cemeteries are public cemeteries. They operate for the public benefit and have the power of eminent domain again. But the court was also dealing with a property that was divided by a street and said, not an issue, it is a continuous piece of land, despite the fact that a road runs through. So the fact that a road runs between these two parcels of land does not prevent approval by the board of this proposal. The only other issue, the legislative entity in New York City modified the law to permit this development, but I'm not sure that the cemetery has acquired all required approvals. I would ask that if the board does approve this transaction, that it make it conditioned on obtaining all required permits and approvals. Those are my only observations on this application.
Thank you, Tony. Any questions by the members of the board?
Not for me, no.
No, I have none.
Okay, so I'll make a motion to approve the application from Old Montefiore Cemetery for a major renovation in the amount of 1.5 million taken from their general fund, subject to the acquiring of all required local approvals and permits. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Thank you, Tom. All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
So application is approved. We have an application from Rockland Cemetery, a major renovation and building demolition. For presentation.
That's me. Sorry. Thought I was muted and I wasn't. Rockland Cemetery acquired property, closed on it in February of 2020. It was approved by the board back in August of 2019, and then there was some back and forth and around about various conditions. The board had not specified that county legislative approval was required. Of course, it is required because you were in Rockland County. Also, we were under the impression that there was a deed restriction in place. There is no deed restriction on the use of the property. There was a contractual agreement between the person who sold the property to its previous owner, the art school, and the current owner, and the art school about its use. That was addressed in back and forth. Council sent a letter in January of 2020 explaining how that would be satisfied, that they didn't need to remove a deed restriction that didn't exist. It's our understanding that all the conditions precedent to closing happened, and they closed and acquired the property. Now there are a series of buildings on the property that they want to take down, 2 of which I believe have asbestos, for which they'll need an asbestos abatement. All of which are there are 2 larger structures and then a bunch of smaller ones. The larger ones are in bad shape and they don't really have any need for them. The smaller ones are completely unsuitable to any cemetery purpose. They have like a kiln and a couple of sheds and they don't need them at all. And they want to clear this area. It's also the area they want to clear is at the end of the existing road into the property. So it would be a logical place, since it's already flat and has no trees, to start developing as the next section for the cemetery, the first new section for the cemetery. So that's where they're at. They do need local. They're going to need permits. They're going to need an asbestos abatement. They're going to need local demolition permits. And so our recommendation on approval is obviously conditioned on that. And having said that, do you want if you give me a sec, I can give you the precise amount they're proposing to spend, which is $128,500. And the only other thing I'll note is that we stated in our report that the cemetery was current in all of its obligations with us. Council pointed out that their annual report form that they had submitted to us, there are certain lines that even if you cross-reference stuff in your audited financials, you have to fill in, and they weren't all filled in. They've now sent us a corrected version. I mentioned this mostly to tell other cemeteries that, number one, even if you do audited financials, you must now, and have for the last 4 years, been required to fill out our form. And there are certain aspects of our form that you can cross-reference stuff in your financials, and other aspects of it clearly noted where you can't do that. So please don't try to cross-reference, and please fill in the lines that are supposed to be filled in. With that said, we're recommending approval. I don't know if anybody has any questions.
I have a couple of questions. Actually, just one question. Going back to the potential restriction on the use, you said the deed was not restricted in terms of the use, but and that it was contractual.
Yes.
Was this transaction, was the sale, did it need to be, was it approved by the Attorney General's office?
The short answer is I think so, and yes. I don't know.
I think so, it was approved, or yes, it was approved.
I can't just tell you for sure whether it needed to be, but it was in fact approved, at least so the cemetery is represented to us.
Okay, because my next.
We lost you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
My next question, and I think what you said resolves it, is even if it's not a deed restriction, if it was a gift to the not-for-profit corporation that was required by the terms of that gift to maintain a certain function, then that would have to be changed or eliminated. And I assume if Attorney General approval was given, that issue was addressed.
Was that the original grantor said, it's fine if you sell it to the, even though our original deal was that this had to stay as an art school, it's now fine if you sell it to the cemetery. The only thing I want to stipulate beyond that is to make sure that it doesn't get further sold.
Okay, and that's all been memorialized and division has seen that?
At some point I saw the Attorney General's approval. I frankly regarded this
Okay.
issue as something that was more your office's issue than ours.
Okay,
So I didn't ask for the underlying documents, figuring that the AG had reviewed them.
I didn't see them in the application, so I was
They're
just,
not. I don't
Okay.
have them.
okay.
My role
That's all.
was, my role in this was very limited as well. They came back to us and said, hey, your condition from the cemetery board when it approved this was address the deed restriction. There is no deed restriction. So I went back, well, division, and I went back to the board and said, can we interpret this as any restriction, not just a deed restriction by letter? And the board said, yes, please do that. So that's what we did. I sent a clarification of the board's condition to clarify that any restriction which prevents it from being transferred to the cemetery has to be addressed prior to such conveyance. And that was my last involvement. So I have no knowledge of what they did after that information was provided to them.
Did you ask them, did you ask council then to respond with how they achieved that or what the status is?
No.
Okay.
I left.
So there's nothing outstanding from your perspective?
That's correct.
Okay.
I have a separate question. When this matter is we're ready to jump to the next matter. Next question.
Yeah.
Okay. The question I had, so obviously they spent money purchasing this. They're about to spend $128,500 clearing these buildings. And at some point they're going to have to spend money to actually develop it and subdivide into lots, landscaping, all that. Those costs add up. And my question for division is, does it foresee this making money even after all those costs are added up? And I was hoping for some financial analysis of that issue.
The short answer is yes, the cemetery does foresee it. The longer and no, we did not prepare such an analysis right now because nobody is seeking to develop a new section. Right now they've acquired the land, so what's done is done. And they have buildings that are potentially an attractive nuisance on the property that have to come down, even if they aren't going to make a dime selling graves on it.
Are there any other questions from the board members, or is the members of the cemetery wish to speak to the issues?
I have no other questions.
Thank you, Tony.
I'm not sure
I
we
have no
one
question.
from Rockland.
Okay, so I'll make a motion to approve the application of Rockland Cemetery for building demolition. Again, could someone provide me with the amount for the
$128,500.
$120,500 paid for out of their general fund?
Correct.
Okay. Do I have a second?
Yeah.
Thank you, Jill. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Okay. The next agenda item will take up some time, and we will probably go to executive session before we take any action, but I want to put on the table the application from Green Springs Natural Cemetery for a land sale. Louis, do you want to make it, or you or your staff make an initial presentation?
Sure. So Green Springs acquired is the only 100% quote unquote green cemetery in New York State. I put that in quotes because New York law doesn't have a definition of what a green cemetery is. They acquired a bunch of land in 2014. They now seek to sell a small piece of that land to a newly created not-for-profit entity that will run a green pet cemetery there. When this application initially came in, we were concerned about its structure primarily because the cemetery was financing the pet cemetery's transaction. And its success or failure was dependent. It could end up owning a pet cemetery if the pet cemetery didn't make money and defaulted on that, which of course would be a problem because the cemetery cannot itself operate a pet cemetery. There are things that human cemeteries can do with pets. There are things that pet cemeteries can do with humans, but a human cemetery can't have a full section of full pet burials as part of itself. So the cemetery restructured the transaction to be, or mostly be, an outright sale of land to the pet cemetery. And is where we're at right now. It's the sale is for $27,000. We have sort of two reservations about the transaction as it's structured right now. Number one is that because of how long this has taken, which is partly on us, the appraisals are now quite old, and we would want those to be updated. We have not asked for updated appraisals because council had a question about the type of appraisal that would be needed, and I didn't want to send them to update these appraisals only to find that they needed some other type instead. The second is that part of the contract of sale provides that the human cemetery will provide certain services to the pet cemetery in return for 20% of the pet cemetery's income. We want to make sure that the cemetery is actually getting for the services it provides the value of those services, but plus hopefully a small profit on those services. So we don't think that would be an appropriate approach, and also committing yourself to it in for all eternity in a sale document seems to us to programmatically be a bad idea. So we would want there to be a mechanism by which the pet cemetery's costs are determined. That if there is going to be such an agreement, we want the human cemetery and pet cemetery to come to an agreement that, from the human side, reflects the value of the services being provided. I know there are a bunch of other questions out there. I came up with a few additional questions by way of background myself. I don't know whether we want to turn to council now. There's some overlap between.
No, why don't we let the cemetery present first?
Sure.
And then we can move to council and board questions and staff questions. So is the cemetery representatives available?
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Herb Engman, I'm the immediate past president of Green Springs for 4 years, and I'm now continuing as a trustee. And from the point of view of Green Springs, I think the sale of the 5 acres of land is pretty straightforward. We meet the criteria under the cemetery law, which are, in our case, no burials on the 5 acres. We don't have burials anywhere near the 5 acres for that part because we have 130 acres of land. And the second criteria is that the sale benefit the corporation and the site owners. And we see the $27,000 in hand now as being much more valuable than any potential sales we could get in the future. I did a little calculation at 3%, and as you know, the division has estimated we have about 600 years of space available to us for Green Springs. And at 3% of $27,000 in 200 years, it would be $10 million. And with compounded interest for 300 years, it becomes $191 million. Now, these figures, of course, are strange. And that brings me to the second point about the assessors. I did approach the local appraisal people about doing a sales approach. The one firm agreed to do it, but later they came back to me and said, this isn't going to work. He said, this is a cemetery. You're looking out centuries. It's meaningless. So the only real way to do this is the comparison approach. That's why we have two appraisals that are the comparison approach rather than using the sales approach. One point about why we set 20% as a fee for maintenance, shared maintenance between the two cemeteries. Green Springs has 14 acres of burial grounds. We were very careful of saying, well, with the pet cemetery might have 3 acres available, considering slopes and depth of bedrock and all that sort of thing. So that's 20% of what our costs are, Green Springs costs are for the maintenance. That's why we use the 20% figure. It would be perfectly fine to go to some other method. We're not concerned about the method on that. But we feel that having $27,000 now to invest, and we've been getting 3% a year for the past couple of years. That's why I use the 3% estimate, is by far the better bet than hoping that there still be human burials in land 300 years from now. So that's basically it. I'd be glad to answer any questions.
Okay, so I mean, I think that in general, in part because of where you started, again, this is Mark Patterson speaking, sorry. You know, the issue, just to frame it up, is this a related party transaction? If so, have we followed the related party transaction requirements? If it's not a related, it's an arm's length sale, what can you do to assure us that it is an independently arm's length transaction? There are certain things in your application that show I know there's some board member overlap, but there's some overlap in terms of postal box, you know, just where mail goes. And so it is, again, those are important because the decisions that are made by the cemetery, Green Springs, have to be done in the best interest of the cemetery, and you want to make sure that there's no influence with the other corporation. So I'll just say that as a frame setting question. And Tony, do you have particular questions that you'd like to ask?
So just for the benefit of the full board, Louis and I were asked to prepare questions so that we make sure we touch on all appropriate subjects on this application. I previously, at the request of Mark, let Mr. Engman know what legal issues I see. You know, the related party, the appraisals, is this actually going to be an independent corporation, or is it a paper corporation, a subsidiary, something else? So I think, you know, let's, if we can, maybe start with Louis's questions, and then I'll chime in after Louis.
Oh, I thought I was. I keep thinking I have to unmute when I'm not muted, which is, I guess, better than speaking when you are muted. So I guess I just had some sort of bigger picture questions, which I know some of this is spelled out in the application, but I think it'd be helpful for the board to hear. Number one is, why did the board of, I'm going to just refer to them as Human Cemetery and Pet Cemetery. Why did the board of the Human Cemetery decide to sell the land to the Pet Cemetery?
This is for me, I assume. Okay. The reason was that we thought that it would be mutually beneficial. That is, people like to be near their pets, regardless of whether they may be in a separate cemetery or not. And we thought it would be mutually beneficial because Green Springs would sell more lots because pet owners would have pets buried next door, or pet owners might want to simply buy lots because they were close by. So we thought it would be mutually beneficial. The second reason is we were pioneers in the natural burial movement. I think we certainly were the first in New York, but we may have been among the first three in the United States. And that's become a very popular movement. We thought we could help start that in pet cemeteries also. The only pet cemeteries I'm aware of near here are in Rochester and Binghamton, and those look like traditional human cemeteries with vaults and statues and all that sort of thing. And so we thought we could help start a natural movement for pet burials also. And to do that, we thought sharing a couple of board members would help the pet cemetery people understand how this stuff works with natural burial, because it's very different, as you've learned over the years, I'm sure. And I think our desire to help the pet cemetery, natural cemetery movement is well placed, because now there are hundreds of natural cemeteries throughout the United States. The last time I looked, there were at least a dozen natural cemeteries in New York. So we think this is the better way to go. Uses a lot less of human resources, pollutes the land less, and most of the residents of Tompkins County, well over 50%, are renters. That means there'll be a market for the pet cemetery because people don't have a backyard to bury their pet in. And we can think of circumstances whereby people prefer to bury their pets rather than have them cremated, just like humans do. They prefer to be buried rather than to be cremated. So we felt for all those reasons, a close relationship would be helpful to Green Springs and maybe even increase our sales a little bit.
So a related question, which would be, this would be a required question if this is in fact a related party transaction, but I think it's a good question even if it isn't, is did you consider alternatives to selling it to the not-for-profit pet cemetery? And if so, why not do that?
We do not want to sell to anybody else other than a pet cemetery. The reason is because of those mutually beneficial things I just mentioned, and we do not want something popping up on our hill, because we own the entire hill basically, that we don't want there. We don't want a house. We don't want a car repair shop. Those are the kinds of things you get in rural areas. We want a natural cemetery. We're running a nature preserve as well as a human cemetery. So we've worked very hard to get habitations off that hill. There are no people living there now, and that fulfills our submission of being a nature preserve. So we're simply not interested. If the pet cemetery sale is not included, then we'll just keep the land as open space.
Okay, so this is something you sort of touched on already, but how much, I know you estimated something like 400 years of, which I guess is in our audit report, something like 400 years of land left for sales. How many acres of unsold land would you still have, unsold, meaning unsold to lot owners, will you have after the sale?
Let's see. Well, we have about 130 acres, so we'd have 125 acres. Now, not all of those are available for burials. You know, we have the road going through the property, as council mentioned. In another situation, we have buildings, we have bedrock, we've got other problems. But I would say we would probably have another 70, 80 acres available for human burial.
You do slightly fewer graves per acre than a standard cemetery because of the distance in natural burials, right?
Right. We have very large lots for a couple of reasons. One is we prohibit vaults, so we don't want one um, grave collapsing on another when we're digging a new one, for example. So we want a substantial amount of soil in between graves. But the other reason is we only mow once a year in the burial areas. So we want enough space to be able to get, in and around individual burial sites, because we leave the soil mounded on the graves and let it settle naturally. Eventually it goes back to ground level. It takes years, of course, to do that, but that's part of the natural process. And it simply means that it gives us a lot more flexibility in getting in without disturbing somebody else's grave site.
So, okay. So these are sort of questions about the linkage between the two entities. So, and I think they all kind of go together. So I'm going to ask all three of them together. So questions are, how will the human cemetery ensure that its provision of service, I know you touched on this a bit, its provision of services to the pet cemetery is in the human cemetery's best interests? How will the human cemetery handle the issue of the overlapping directors? And how will the human cemetery, and I know you specifically addressed this, so you don't have to repeat yourself, how will the human cemetery benefit, other than the 27 grand, obviously, and payment from services, from having the pet cemetery adjoining it?
Yeah, the thought was that if we were able to be contiguous by selling the 5 acres with the pet cemetery, then rather than having the pet cemetery buy its own equipment, which might be problematic, it costs $30,000 to buy a backhoe on a tractor, that we could simply provide services and then have an income stream. So we have a little bit of extra money coming in, even though we don't control the pet cemetery. As far as the directors go, we anticipate the shared 2 directors as a temporary proposition. Right now, the cemetery board has 5 members, which is just the founding members. And once we know that it's a go, I would think they would want to recruit a number of additional members. Green Springs now has 11. I think I said 10 in one of the previous messages, and I was mistaken. I found that we had indeed increased to 11. So 2 of our 11 would sit on the Pet Cemetery Board. But once the Pet Cemetery Board has a few more members, then the 2 from Green Springs can drop off, and then we would have not that linkage, but hopefully the culture, the procedures of a natural cemetery will have become ingrained in the new organization. I think that was it.
Yeah, that was what I had. I know council had some other questions or more specific questions within those rubrics. So I guess I will defer to, well, unless, Mark, at what point do you want to see if the board has questions?
Yeah, let's
start. Who goes when?
Tony can raise some issues and we'll move to the board, as we usually do. So Tony, do you have some questions you'd like to ask? That, again, the point of this is to get as much information in public session as we can, so that the board has full information about the transaction. Again, because of some of those issues, we will likely go to executive session. But Tony, do you have some questions you'd like to ask to make sure the board has the information it needs?
Yes, thank you, Mark. Hi, Mr. Engman. It's nice to put a face and name to the emails we've exchanged. First, I want you to know I'm very impressed by what Green Springs does. I went to your website, looked at the videos and everything, and Congratulations to you and your board for what you're doing. But I have a number of questions. Some of them actually just popped up in your answers to Lewis's questions. On the appraisal, when I reviewed that appraisal report, it read to me as if the appraiser was ready to do an income approach until he was told by someone from Green Springs but that land's not going to be sold for hundreds of years. And then he shifted to a comparison approach. So my reading is a little different from what you've presented, but I can speak to the appraiser on that. The second thing that came out in your discussion with Lewis is how that 20% got calculated. Correct me if I'm wrong, I think you said you currently have 13 acres that Green Springs currently maintains, that's cleared, and is that right?
14.
14?
No, there are 14 acres that are burial grounds right now.
Okay. And you estimated that the pet cemetery will have about 3%, so that indicates about 20% of the 14, roughly.
Right.
But that's not what was written. It wasn't that the pet cemetery would pay 20% of Green Springs Cemetery cost. It said that the pet cemetery would pay 20% of its income to Green Springs Cemetery. That's a percentage of a very different number. So maybe you can clarify that a little bit.
Well, it was simply the way we thought of to try to get a percentage. If that doesn't work, we're perfectly willing to sit down and calculate hours of machinery use and that sort of thing. It just seemed like one way of calculating. If it were 20% of what we spend on the human cemetery side, then it'd be 20% of income to help pay for that. It just seemed like an equivalency. But again, we're not wedded to that. If the desire to have some sort of other calculation, we'll do it another way.
So that brings us to, one of the questions I've been trying to wrap my head around is who's actually doing the negotiating? I noticed in the incorporation papers, Mr. Zesterman and you are listed as original incorporators. The address for the pet cemetery is Mr. Zesterson's home address on Maplewood, Motor Drive in Ithaca. And he is now president of the Green Springs Cemetery Board, and that address hasn't changed. So it looks like you and Mr. Zesterman are heavily involved on both corporations. You're the former president of the Green Springs. He's the current president. He seems to be heavily, actively involved in the pet cemetery side. In fact, one of your newsletters that you put out asked whoever receives your newsletter, I assume it goes to lot owners, customers, donors, asked your folks on your side to help with the pet cemetery and gave Mr. Zesterson's email address, name, phone number as a contact if you want to help with fundraising or even donate. So getting back to the question, who is actually negotiating on each side, for example, on this 20% clause?
Yeah, certainly Ken Zesterson and I have been involved with it from the beginning. There are a couple of reasons for that. One is Ken established the first dog park, well, the only dog park in Tompkins County. He was the driving force behind that. So he's very familiar with the dog community. He has done something similar before. And I was very much involved with the creation of that dog park also, because I was the town supervisor of the town of Ithaca. I worked with the city of Ithaca and New York State Parks and Recreation to get it established. So we were simply knowledgeable about how to go about doing these sorts of things. Part of it is coincidence. We thought this would be settled years ago in terms of the sale of land. We started this process 4 years ago and provided all the information 2 years ago that we thought were the final questions. And Ken was not president then, and he became president of Green Springs, and it was just coincidence. As far as the mailing address, it didn't seem reasonable to expect the pet cemetery to have a post office box, for example, which is what Green Springs has, until it actually had land and could negotiate with people to bury their pets there. So Ken just used his address because we had to have some place people could inquire or send information. And so that's why he used his address. Once the path to a pet cemetery becomes clear, the pet cemetery can establish a post office box and so forth. But right now, there was just no need for it.
I take it from your response that you and Mr. Zesterson were coming up with the terms of agreement, the original agreement that's now been replaced with this new agreement that has the 20% clause.
We worked with the cemetery, the pet cemetery board. There was a board elected, and so we sat down with them, talked about it. There was simply no disagreement between the pet cemetery board and the Green Springs board. There was nothing to negotiate. Usually you would negotiate over the price of the land, but that was dictated by the state, not by us. So there was no negotiation on that. The rest of it, everybody's in agreement. So there was no need to negotiate anything. We just looked over the matters and said, yeah, this is fine. Everybody, including the 5 members of the Pet Cemetery Board and well, actually there are only 9 at the current time of the Green Springs Board.
Well, actually, let me ask you, it appears from what's been filed with the Department of State that Mr. Zesterson's on that board, correct?
He's on both.
Okay. And are you on both?
No.
Because your name is on the original initial incorporation page.
Yeah, but I'm not a board member of the Pet Cemetery. I actually have no as the saying goes, no dog in this hunt, in the sense that I don't have a dog. I don't have a pet. I have a yard. I'll bury my cat in the backyard when the time comes, although he's going to outlive me, I think. So I really have no personal interest in terms of burying a pet in a pet cemetery. My interest is building the movement of natural cemeteries. And the pet cemetery is the new dimension that I think would be great for everyone.
So let me just read you from what was filed with the New York Department of State Division of Corporations. Paragraph 7th, the initial directors of the corporation until the first annual meeting are as follows. And the third name listed is Herbert John Engman, 120 Warren Road, Ithaca, New York, 14850. That's you, right, Mr. Engman?
Right.
Yeah. So did you ever formally remove yourself from the board?
No, I was never on the board. The board was elected. The first board was elected. I was not on the board, but I was part of the incorporation or the request for incorporation to the state. Yes.
So let me ask you about the other names. There's a Deb Clary from Camillus, New York. You know Ms. Clary?
Deb Clary. Yes. The members of the Pet Cemetery Board are Margaret Solstein, Catherine Goldberg, Deb Clary, Joanne James, and Ken Zesterson.
You personally know Deb Clary?
I don't. I met her at the meetings, but I don't know her.
Do you know if she has any relationship to Green Springs Cemetery, the human cemetery?
Not that I know of. She could be a lot holder, and I wouldn't know about it because I don't deal with all of the site owners. In fact, I don't know about Margaret and Catherine either, whether they're site owners or not. I mean, we have 1,100 site owners, so I don't know who all has bought sites there. I've only been involved with Green Springs for the past well, basically 5 years in terms of management. I was involved before Green Springs was established in other ways, but I was only asked to be involved in the management about 5 years ago.
So as far as you know, Deb Clary isn't related in any way to any board member, officer, director. And when I say related, I mean blood, marriage, business relationship.
Not that I know
What about Margaret May Solstein? Is she related to Green Springs or any of its board officers, key people?
of. Not that I know of, no.
And then the last name, I think you gave me Catherine Goldstein. Is that right?
Goldberg.
Goldberg, sorry. Can't read my own handwriting. The same questions, any relationship to the cemetery or the folks?
Not that I know of. Again, it's possible they could be site owners. I just don't know. I'd have to ask somebody to look it up on the database.
Is Mr. Zesserman on this call? Is he available to answer questions?
No, he's not on the call.
All right. Now, let me ask you about that newsletter. It was the, I think, spring 2020 newsletter. Let me call that up. Now, I know it says Green Springs has a proposal pending with the Division of Cemeteries to sell 5 acres to Green Springs Animal Companion Cemetery. The plan originated from Ken Zesserson. And it says, also skipping down now, the pet cemetery originally had a target date of this summer, but it's unable to proceed until the full purchase price of the acreage can be raised. If you're interested in learning more and helping with this fundraising effort or making a donation, please contact our current president, Ken Zesserson, by email. Gives the email address, or by phone, it gives the phone. What led Green Springs to put this in their newsletter? Who drafted this? Who made the decision? Do you know?
The newsletter is produced by one of our burial coordinators, and she asks board members if they have any articles they want to put in. And Ken probably sent this on. And in retrospect, if I had been more on the ball, I might have. Well, as a matter of fact, I don't always see the entire newsletter. So I would have said, yeah, we shouldn't be asking for funds through our newsletter. So I would agree that I think we should not have put that in the newsletter. But I think it was done innocently. It wasn't a thought that somehow Green Springs was going to set up the pet cemetery for itself.
So initially, I think Lewis mentioned it, initially the Green Springs Cemetery was going to lend the $27,000 to the pet cemetery. That was a problem. So now the pet cemetery, as we see, is doing fundraising to come up with, I think, about $40,000 in startup funds. Have members of the board of Green Springs Cemetery contributed to that? Do you know?
Yeah, Ken has pledged, I think, 3,000 of the, I think it's 42,000 total so far. And I have said that I would put up 15,000. And I'm used to doing this because I gave the first 100 acres, the cottage, to Green Springs. That was my involvement before I went on the board. So I've been a benefactor of Green Springs. I also provided about $23,000 to buy the 30 acres in holding that we bought a few years ago. So I've been deeply involved with financing of these operations. And since Green Springs was so spectacularly successful, I thought that investing in the movement of natural burial would be a good thing to do.
So this would be, as you just said, an investment on your part in the pet cemetery.
and investment in the future of natural burial. There's, these are two tiny little nonprofits. There's no money to be made. We have fewer than 30 burials a year at Green Springs, and the Pet Cemetery has estimated they might, at least initially, bury 12 pets a year. Hopefully that would increase for them over time, but we're all volunteers. All we're trying to do is try to do some good for the community, and there's certainly no money to be made by anybody in these operations. These aren't like the big cemeteries downstate. Earlier, you talked about directors getting paid hundreds of thousands of dollars. Doesn't happen up here. We're all volunteers.
So let me ask you this. In my correspondence with you, you've indicated a number of things about how that pet cemetery is going to be operated. It's not going to have paid staff. You expect it to have volunteers. It's going to have a phone number, but no office. You expect, I think this is correct, that folks who volunteer for Green Springs are also going to be volunteering for the pet cemetery. It's going to be right there on the same plot of land. So I guess my question is, maybe you've answered this already, but since you're on the Green Springs end of this transaction, who is coming up with these operational decisions on the pet cemetery end? Who is telling you, well, no, we're not going to build an office. We're going to use the same volunteers. How is all that information flowing?
Well, I don't know that we've ever said we're going to be using the same volunteers. There will be recruitment, I assume, by the pet cemetery to get volunteers to work that end of it. There may be some overlap. I'm perfectly willing to volunteer for the pet cemetery as well as Green Springs. That's what I do. I'm retired. But there isn't necessarily going to be that overlap. I'm sorry, what was the other part of the question?
Oh, the decision not to have an office or that kind of thing.
Oh, yeah, well, it's financial. I mean, that's like the decision about buying a tractor specifically for the pet cemetery. You add another $30,000 or an office, you would add what? Green Springs didn't have an office until about 4 years ago. We relieved the caretaker of the cottage and we turned it into an office. But that's traditional in upstate rural cemeteries. I don't know of any that have offices. The one I'm most familiar with is Lakeview, which once had a caretaker's office, but they fixed that up and they now rent it for income. So they don't have an office. That's the standard in upstate New York. We don't have offices for cemeteries.
Well, so here's kind of the point that an overall concern is that folks are going to see these two entities as one. You're both called Green Springs, which by itself is problematic. I mean, I note in your website, even in your board application, you often abbreviate Green Springs Cemetery as simply Green Springs. I assume Green Springs Animal Companion Cemetery is also going to be generally abbreviated as Green Springs. And you're going to be on the same plot of land. The only office that's going to exist on that plot of land is the Green Springs Human Cemetery office. So people are going to show up, and the only office they're going to be able to go to if they're there for the pet cemetery is the office of the human cemetery. The whole dynamic seems to be to have in appearance and in operation that there's one Green Springs, the human cemetery part and the pet cemetery part. And that's a concern, I think, for the board to grapple with is, should we be allowing that kind of appearance to exist, should people be walking into a pet cemetery and going to the human cemetery office to get help with the pet cemetery? You know, is there going to be a perception that there's one Green Springs with two parts?
Yeah. Yeah, I frankly shared some of that concern with the use of Green Springs as part of the title for the pet cemetery. Others felt strongly that we could be mutually beneficial, and it might avoid confusion because we'd both be on Irish Hill Road. And if people automatically thought, oh, no, that can't be the pet cemetery, that's where the human cemetery is. Well, if you put the same name on the same road, then that eliminates any confusion. We certainly could have signage. There's a separate entrance to the 5 acres where the pet cemetery would be. It's different from the entrance to Green Springs Human Cemetery. And the office is not a public office. It's used to store records and for staging things. The public does not go in there. We have an outhouse for those visitors who need a bathroom. This cottage is off the grid. It does not have electricity. So all of those factors come into play, and it's not a public office. It's just a place for Green Springs staff and volunteers to store their stuff.
So despite all those concerns, you're still determined to keep the name Green Springs for the pet cemetery? You're not going to address that?
My preference would be to have a different name, but that's only my preference. The rest of the folks outvoted me in sense of saying that they thought it was better that it be the same name. There is an obvious differentiation in that we have natural companion animal cemetery. So it seems pretty clear that it's not a human cemetery. Although, of course, humans are animals, but people don't get into those technicalities generally thinking about it.
Well, I also want to touch on the suitability of the land. There's been a lot of questions about, how much money could Green Springs Cemetery make if it keeps the land? Division's accountant estimated up to $1 million if you kept the land. And I know you've said, well, we're not going to use that for hundreds of years. That actually seems counterintuitive. It's very expensive to clear land. Somebody's not muted.
No, sorry.
No problem. So it's expensive to clear land, and only 14 acres of your land is cleared. Wouldn't it make more sense to sell whatever portion of this 5 acres for burial and cremation burial before you start clearing land, not as the last lot sold? And I would note that lots of cemeteries have more desirable and less desirable land. And what they do is they differentiate in price. The more desirable land is much more expensive if you're going to buy a lot there than the less desirable land. So wouldn't, in fact, if you're going to make up to $1 million on this, wouldn't it make sense to keep it, use it, sell as much as you can before you start getting into the expense of clearing additional land?
Well, let me clarify. We've already done the expensive clearing. We spent tens of thousands of dollars to clear trees from the property. And I'm the head mower, so I know that land intimately. I mow it once every 3 years, the parts that aren't used for burials. So we actually have all of the land available that we need to have available now. This 5 acres is the least attractive for human burials because we've got our big storage barn where we keep some of our equipment. And then on the other side of the 5 acres, we've got a 2-acre emergency communications tower. It used to be a microwave tower and the county took it over. So not really a very attractive place. and we think humans would be somewhat reluctant to want to be buried there. The other problem is depth to bedrock. We did one hole we dug, and we hit bedrock at 2 feet, and the bedrock comes out at the road right on the surface. The road consists of bedrock. So we don't know, frankly, how many graves we could dig in there. And the pet cemetery won't know. They're just going to have to take the chance. But they dig less deep than we do. So if they dig 2 feet deep to bury a dog, our criteria is at least 3 feet. And that 1 foot can make a lot of difference when you have bedrock right near the surface. There are some steep slopes on the 5-acre parcel. That's why I said that, you know, they might be able to bury pets on 3 of the 5 acres, steep slopes and bedrock, but we won't know until we start digging. So that would probably be the last section that Green Springs would want to try to bury people on if we were to keep the land, because why spend money on surveying and laying out the lots and get in there and find out that we've got very few that are sellable because we simply can't get down far enough. All of those factors come into play, and that's why we've said that we probably won't use that site, if ever, for several hundred years. And, you know, the other thing I want to point out is we don't even know if land burials are going to be permitted several hundred years from now. Land may become so valuable, it'll be prohibited. And people will have to use cremation, which is not very environmentally friendly, or they may go to the type of mixture at Cornell, how they get rid of the cattle and cows, the hydrolysis type system. We don't know what the future of burials is going to be. So we don't even know if we could use that land when we try to get around. That's why we're saying $27,000 in hand increases our permanent maintenance fund by 25%. Plus we put it in the bank, we'll be earning millions of dollars in compounded interest over a century or two. So we figure we'll get more out of it, and it's a more secure investment on our part than just waiting to see if we can use that sometime.
Thank you.
I think that's a great point. The permanent maintenance fund, however, our division accountant says it's well funded. It's not like you're underfunded and you really need this $27,000 to get it. The division says it needs to be. And it, you know, as division has told you, you can't use any of that money for general funds. It all has to go into.
Tony, do you have
Sorry.
many more questions to ask?
No, just a few. I know I'm dominating. There's so many legal issues, and I know when we go into executive session, we're going to want as strong a factual background as possible to deal with have a good open discussion of the legal issues. So I know I'm almost done, Mark. Thank you. On the question of the suitability of the land. So backing up just a bit, one of our members of our board is Letitia James, the Attorney General of the state of New York, through her representative, Jill Faber. They regulate charities. This transaction is actually important to them, I think, on both sides, from the human cemetery side and the not-for-profit pet cemetery side. They regulate charities at the Attorney General's office. So they're going to have a concern on the other side of whether the pet cemetery, not-for-profit corporation, is meeting its requirements. And, you know, that 20% clause is going to be part of that. But the additional concern is, well, has the pet cemetery done its due diligence in looking for land? If this land isn't suitable for human burials, believe me, when we told pet cemeteries they couldn't accept human cremated remains anymore, you caught all kinds of flack from the public because people want to be buried with their pet remains. And they view pets like their children. So if this plot of land is not attractive for human burials, how can it be attractive for pet burials, for, you know, their kids, quote unquote, as they view them? As the pet cemetery, since it has its own independent duty, looked at other land. I did a quick search on Zillow. There's quite a few vacant parcels, even cheaper than this $27,000 price. So there's a real question as to, does the pet cemetery have an independent duty to go and look at other parcels, even though you guys on the human cemetery side really want to have a pet cemetery on your land? Is this really the best business move for the pet cemetery? Do you have any thoughts on that?
They have looked at least one other parcel, I know. But I think what's holding them back is the initial investment of buying equipment, having a place to store equipment. You know, it's not just the land. You're starting to look at, you know, $30,000 for a tractor, you know, $20,000 to build a shed to park it in. You start to get into all sorts of other expenses. This is why the mutual benefit between the two cemeteries is so valuable. But yes, I know they've looked at least one other parcel of land, but again, I think they are not, the Pet Cemetery Board is not in disagreement that affiliating right contiguous with Green Springs proper is a good thing, and that's what they're most interested in. But yeah, I don't know what all they've done, but I know they've looked at least one parcel, one additional parcel of land.
Well, Tony, we don't regulate pet cemeteries, right? So there's no,
Right,
we don't really care if they've done it in their interest or not.
right.
I'm not going to speak for Jill. I think I'll let her address any concerns she has. Just to finish up, so it looks like you have a lot of proposed agreements between the two entities. But from what I can see, the boards haven't formally met and approved those agreements. Is that correct? Nothing's.
The Green Springs, yeah, both have approved all of them, but because of all the questions from the division and from you, there are going to have to be changes. So we will have to go back and re-vote on basically the entire package again when we have the revised versions of them. And again, I know there was a concern about conflict of interest. This is the time when board members will have to declare their possible conflicts of interest, and then we'll have to go from there. So yeah, we'll have to go back and redo that because there have been so many changes in the documents.
Okay. You understand that probably has to occur first before this board can approve it. A big issue for the board.
Well, now why should that be? Why are we going through all these extra steps, including paying attorneys, before we know we can sell the land? This just doesn't make any sense. You can't do these other things until we know we can sell the land. This is very frustrating. You know, you're saying everything has to be perfect and we have to spend thousands of dollars. Doing these reappraisals is going to cost another $1,000. And it's so unnecessary because this thing is dragged on so long. And I'm sorry to expel my frustration, but this has been very frustrating, this entire process, because so much of it is irrelevant to the sale of land. I explained in the beginning, cemetery law is very clear. We have met all the criteria for selling the land. There's really no other factors that come into play here.
So that's not entirely accurate. When there are conflicts of interest, we require that the standards of the not-for-profit corporation law be met before we approve a transaction. We just had one with Beverly Hills Cemetery, where fathers of the cemetery operator were selling land for millions of dollars. They couldn't convince us that they had met the conflict of interest related party transaction requirements before the board voted on the application. The board denied the application in part because they hadn't first complied with those requirements. So it's consistent with the board's duty. I think we lost Mr. Eggman. I don't see his image anymore, but I'll finish up for the audience. It's consistent with the board's duty that these issues are resolved before, because there's no guarantee that they're going to be resolved after or resolved correctly. So since Mr. Eggman, since the Pet Cemetery acknowledges they have to redo all the agreements and revote, it's perfectly appropriate and should be a requirement that occur first, so we can review the minutes and give confidence that in fact these provisions were complied with before we approve the transaction.
Or approval can be given contingent on doing that. That's fine also. But, you know, this business of conflict of interest, what interests are conflicted? Nobody's going to make any money off these things. We're just trying to do something good. And there are no conflicts in that sense, but we will go through. We have a conflict of interest policy. We will follow it. And those who are decided by the boards have a conflict of interest, they'll simply not participate in the discussion or the vote.
Thank you, sir. I want to be more, I mean, we've had a good discussion. I want to be respectful of the board members' time, your time, other members' time. So Tony, unless you have other issues, I'd like to conclude, ask the board members if they have any questions
Thank you for your patience. I'm done asking questions. Thank you.
I appreciate that. Appreciate your questions. Do the board members have any other questions of this applicant?
I have a couple of questions. So with regard to the Pet Cemetery Board, do you know, I know, you know, you said you're not currently a board member, but do you know if they've had board meetings where the discussions have centered on what the relationship between the two entities will be, you know, approving the purchase, for example? Are there minutes of board meetings from the Pet Cemetery Board?
Yeah. The Pet Cemetery Board has not met very much because there's been nothing to meet about. Until they have land, they really can't do anything. Everything is contingent upon knowing that they're going to have land to deal with. Otherwise, it makes no sense for them to do much else.
So they haven't met to approve the purchase?
I'm trying to remember I'm just looking at one that I had pulled. No, I only pulled one. I didn't see it in those, but it may be in other minutes. I just don't know. Okay. I'd have to go back and ask them for their minutes.
And look, I hear what you're saying, and I don't think any of us who are listening to your presentation or who have reviewed, you know, the application think that, you know, you folks are anything but well-intentioned and, you know, wanting to have a pet cemetery that's consistent with, you know, the natural practices that you have in the human cemetery. But, you know, just to echo what Mr. Melillo said, we have an obligation as a board to approach each transaction, you know, to make sure it's consistent with the statutory provisions, regardless of, you know, the specific facts and the, you know, the motivations of the people who are involved. So, you know, bear with us. It's just something that we need to do by law. And, you know, one thing that's important, and I think it was touched on, but I just want to amplify it, is that a cemetery corporation has certain, is permitted to operate in certain ways and is not permitted to operate in others. And
Mhm.
what we're trying to get at is whether the relationship between the human cemetery and the pet cemetery will be such that the cemetery corporation will be engaging in activities that are not specifically enumerated and permitted for a human cemetery. And
Mhm.
it sounds as though the relationships are such that there is going to be an enormous amount of involvement by the cemetery corporation in the activities and the running of the pet cemetery, at least at the beginning, as you've described it. And so that's one thing that if there's, if there's anything that you have in terms of, memorializations or agreements that reflect the division of activities and how each of the entities will run, that would be very helpful to us in analyzing the application.
Yeah, I think a lot of how things are going to run comes after the Pet Cemetery Corporation knows that it has land to deal with. For example, how do you lay out lots? How do you have the flow of customers, so to speak, and who deals with those customers? There have been initial discussions of that, but nobody wants to take time to work all this stuff out without knowing whether they're going to have land to deal with. And one thing that sort of bothers me about this conflict of interest stuff is it almost sounds like prior restraint, that you're assuming there's a conflict of interest, even though I don't see where that comes in. If the attorney general or somebody else wants to come in later and say, you guys are doing it all wrong and you have a conflict of interest, yeah, fine, we're willing to go undergo that review. But to say in advance that this is what's happening doesn't seem to me appropriate. And again, I think the only question at hand here is, do we meet the criteria for selling land under cemetery law? And it's very clear we do.
Well, I appreciate your patience with us in asking these questions. I know it's from your, interest in the movement. So again, I think nobody's implying anything other than that. Are there other questions of board members?
Yeah, I have one quick question. It's my understanding the land that you are looking at selling was only acquired in 2014. Is that correct?
It's part of a 30-acre parcel. Yeah.
I'm just curious, it was when that land was purchased, was there any consideration at that time, was any internal discussion of purchasing that for the purpose of forming a pet cemetery?
No, that was well before any discussion came. That was before I or Ken Zesserson or anybody else was involved with Green Springs in terms of management. This was a 30-acre inholding. In other words, Green Springs surrounded these 30 acres. So we saw this as really a dicey problem. It could be somebody could buy that and use the 30 acres for who knows what in a rural area. So we bought it in order to have it. And the 5 acres just happened to be part of the 30 acres.
Thank you.
Okay. I will entertain a motion to go to executive session. I'm not sure I personally feel we need it, but if any other board member does, I'll vote for it. Is there an interest in going to executive session?
Mark, before we do that, can we see if we have any comments from the public so that they don't have to hang around for?
Yes. Okay. Thank you. Okay. So we will hold on the discussion about executive session for one moment. Is there members of the public that wish to address the board? David?
I'm fine today, thank you.
We wore you down. Any other members of the public wishing to address the board? Okay, thank you. No, we've exhausted our public. Do we have a motion to move to executive session?
Mark, before we do that, let's also give the next meeting date, October 13th at 10:30.
Thank you. You're backstopping me, Louis. Appreciate it. So I mean, if there's no motion to go to executive session, then we would take up the issue of the cemetery's application to sell its land. What's the pleasure of the board?
I think we should, I'd like to make a motion to go to executive session.
Okay, I'll second that. All in favor?
Aye.
Again, we will go into executive session. We go to a different meeting. We'll leave this meeting open for anybody wishing to. And if you'd like us to notify you when we're coming back out, you can send an email to Louis. Or Louis, do you have information from the applicant or anyone else that we need to talk about?
I have contact information both for Mr. Engman and for David Fleming, and I can text them when we're ready to come out of executive session if there's anything we're going to do other than say, other than just come out of it. If there's anyone else who wants to, please post in the comments that you want to be notified when we're back on, and I can, whoever's babysitting can shoot it to me, and I can let them know when we're back out. Just as a matter of procedure, I'm going to open the executive session immediately, but I'd like to take a 2-minute break.
Okay, for the board members, if you haven't already taken advantage of the opportunity to meet remotely and sneak in breaks, feel free to take one now, and we'll join you in the meeting that was set for executive session. This meeting will stay open. We'll mute the line and come back out when we're done. Thank you. Thank you. All right, so the board has come out of executive session. We're back in public session. We took no action in executive session. Mr. Engelman, thank you for your time and patience with us. I hope you understand you are trying to do something as you did before that's groundbreaking, and so there's some new things that you have to work through. It's the sense of the board that this is a related party transaction that needs to comply with Article 7, Section 15.
Section 715, sorry.
715, my apologies. And that it would be, we think it might be in your interest, it's obviously up to you, to have counsel to help you through that. Might be in the interest of the pet cemetery to do so as well, so that we can make sure that the concerns that come up in a related party transaction are clarified. This is important to the board because we have other circumstances. This is a public policy and precedentiary issue that we need to make sure we're handling this consistent with other applications. So we think, we think it can be done. We understand that this is done well-intentioned, perhaps even a good idea, but the board is obligated to have a process that makes sure we follow the law and that you are not doing things that are not permitted by the not-for-profit law. So I'm going to stop there. Do other board members want to add to that sense of the board?
No, I think you summed it up well.
Okay.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. So again, we are not approving the application, but we'll be glad to rehear it. There's no prejudice when we think when you think you're ready to bring back to us an application that meets the requirements of a related party transaction. I don't think that's unclear. I think many of the documents that we've asked for are documents that were already helpful. They need to be to us before we approve the application. And again, this is more my personal opinion. I think that you see the sale of the land is the first step, but in terms of our approval, we need to see the whole package before we can approve the transaction. Do you have any other questions of us, Mr. Engelman?
Could somebody send the reference to the related something or other to me so that I can understand what the details are, because I couldn't hear it all.
It's actually on our website under the cemetery law manual. It's I'm saying this. Start with section 715 of the not-for-profit corporation law. It is in our cemetery law manual.
Louis, send them the link, will you? Louis, send them the link if you can.
I do want to caution Mr. Engman. There's a lot more to the related party transaction than section 715. There's a whole bunch of definitions. There's a whole bunch of case law. So I don't think you can fully understand the issues just by looking at section 715, which relates to the board's suggestion that it would be advisable to get counsel.
We need to do this right, Mr. Engelman. I understand your frustration. It has taken too long. I guess, again, being pioneers, that's part of what happens when you're dealing with government. But we will do everything we can to move this along, but we need to make sure that we've got the documentation we need to approve it as a related party transaction. So again, I don't think there's anything more we can say at this point. Okay, we appreciate your time, Mr. Engelman. And at this point, I would say I don't think there's any other business before the board. Would I take a motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn.
I'll second that.
All right, thank you all for, everyone, that it's been a long meeting, but it's the work that goes ahead of time. We know that people are coming to us looking for us to resolve issues, and we appreciate their forbearance in going through all that. Thank you. Meeting adjourned.
Thank you.